And here we are. We are just about to begin session 2 of our book discussion brought to us by the Reading League, the Vermont chapter. And let me just share my screen with you. And you can kind of, all right, and bring us into our slideshow. Oh, there we go, and current slide. How's that for bright red for February? Okay, everyone. Let's start with what my plan is for today. First of all, let me say that I'd like this to be a little bit less formal than rather a lecture. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of discussion going. I thought we'd begin with just a tad of review, and we'll get to that. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about different kinds of tests and test scoring systems. I've been doing this for a long time, for about 30 years. And what I'm finding is that we haven't adequately trained educators in the language of assessment, and that a little bit of knowledge of test scoring systems, I know it sounds like dreadfully dull, like don't let your eyes glaze over, but just a little bit of knowledge about test scores can make all the difference in the world when you are looking at an evaluation, when you are either proofing your own report or reading reports that was done by somebody else. I thought we'd talk a little bit about some of the things to look for when you're reading a report by an unknown evaluator, or some of the things to think about when you're proofing your own work. They kind of go hand in hand. So that was sort of my plan today. But first of all, I thought we would begin, and we're a small group. I was going to divide us into groups, but I thought we would begin with a little bit of discussion of something that you guys learned last week, something that kind of surprised you, something that discouraged you or distressed you or just made you deliriously happy. I mean, was there anything from, can we get someone to sort of volunteer and talk just a little bit about what you learned regarding maybe the simple view, or maybe the content of what should go into a comprehensive reading evaluation?
Can I?
Sandy?
Yes. I have to say, I train a lot of educators. I do training in Orton Gillingham, and right now we're in the midst of our therapy class, and my whole therapy class is using your book, and a lot of it is about evaluation. And when I actually wrote down your quote, listening comprehension speaks to a child's potential for reading comprehension, presuming they can read all the words. That just struck me again, because there are still evaluators out there that aren't evaluating listening comprehension. And so I actually put that quote in my Google Classroom for my teachers taking the course. And so they were all excited, and they said, tell us more, tell us more. So well, I told them today's going to be the big one, because we're struggling with what blurbs to tell districts to stop using grade equivalents. And so they said, make sure you get a good blurb, make sure you know, so we can go back.
So yeah, we're going to talk about grade equivalents. I'll be sure that we hit grade equivalents today. And the other thing that actually is one of my favorite things to do is take a look at what happens when we test young children, and the fact that sometimes when they get 0 raw scores, when they don't complete any of the items like correctly, they actually get rather high standard scores, which make it look like they have some skill. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. I feel like that's, fessing up on the part of evaluators, in that I want to say we're not so good at measuring the skills of young children, but let me say that differently. I think that the tools, many of the tools that we have to measure the skills of kids in kindergarten and kids in first grade are somewhat flawed, and we'll talk about like why, sort of why they are flawed. But anyway, those are sort of two fun conversations that I like to have. Well, I hope I give you your sound bite today, Sandy. I have to say that listening comprehension for me has always been it's eye-opening during an evaluation, right? And it's also a chance for kids to strut their stuff. So here it is, they're struggling with reading. We spend a lot of time looking at phonemic awareness, which they probably don't have. We look at their sound symbol correspondence and their phonics skills, and those are all things, their reading fluency, that are just really hard for them. And then we look at what they're able to do through their ears. So they finally get a chance to demonstrate their skills, and it is sort of a potential for their ability to make meaning from language and print. It's also a really nice thing to talk to parents about, because in a situation where we frequently are talking about a lot of weaknesses, it's an opportunity to discuss a strength, and it's not a minor strength. It's a real important thing. So so anyway, Sandy, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else have anything that kind of struck you?
Sorry, I'm joining late. I was actually at a meeting talking about a student after school, and
Oh.
I'm thinking about the plus and minus chart that you showed between listening comprehension and decoding. And
Oh,
I had
okay.
brought it up when we were talking about the student because he's actually a very fluent decoder. But there seems to be a disconnect between, reading a passage fluently and then answering questions about that passage. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper, but it really made me think, that chart made me think about what his strengths and growth areas are.
Yeah, Terry, I'm going to take us to, I'm just going to, oops, let me take us, I just want to go to this chart for a second. You know, when I think about things that if I were to do a second edition that I would do differently, this would not be structured in the same way. And what I would do is I would move the whole listening comprehension section and put it under fluency, so that fluency would be a product of skill with word recognition and also a product of skill with receptive language. Because I think that we talk a lot about kids who struggle with reading fluency due to decoding challenges, but we also have a group of kids who struggle with reading fluency because they are decoding more slowly to give themselves a chance to take in and process all that language. So sometimes like reading fluency is due to receptive language issues, which is not sort of reflected in my chart here. Did everyone kind of understand what I just said? I don't have a visual for you on it, and I really should just redo my, these charts are not so easily done. They can take hours, but really what I would do is take that whole listening comprehension and put it sort of on a parallel level with reading, decoding, and spelling, as being a contributing factor to reading fluency. So yeah, sometimes that disconnect is in the processing of the language and not so much in the decoding. So, and that's something I don't feel that we look at very much or talk about very much, because I don't think we have a way of measuring the ability to take in language with speed. Yeah. So, okay.
Could I ask then, if I understand, hi, sorry, I'm just getting in as well.
No, it's okay. We're fine.
I'm curious about, I was thinking a lot about this graphic as well. We've had an ongoing discussion about comprehension, what you do to support comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
comprehension is more of an outcome than a necessarily of a particular skill.
Yes.
So with that in mind, if fluency, if this is a higher kind of a hierarchy, it's not really set up, but like what goes at the level of fluency then? If missing comprehension moves to the right, is it just fluency, or is there
Yeah,
another?
it would just be fluency. And I think, Michael, you had mentioned sort of last time too, that this is a real focus. I'm calling this a focused evaluation of reading, and that we could really be thinking on a much bigger level or deeper level. We could think about how cognitive skills contribute to. So in my chart here, I don't have, I'm not talking about working memory. We're not talking about processing speed. I'm not talking about the role of visual spatial thinking and how that contributes. So this is um, a real sort of focused look at reading, but it really could be much larger. And if that were the case, right, we might also be talking about strategies to support that executive function, because our student would benefit from strategies to sort of support that working memory platter, strategies to help discern what's important, what's not. That's that whole strategic look at reading, I think, kind of comes in at that executive function level. So anyway, anyone else have a comment or something that surprised you or made you rethink your practice as an evaluator, or what happens when you read an evaluation? Okay, well, if not, oh, yes, hi, Gwen.
I guess the one thing that I take away from these conversations is really the importance of building the oral language and language alongside the building of these decoding skills. And I think sometimes they get kind of skewed a little bit. And it's just nice to kind of keep that in mind as a frame, to always be aware of like that there's real value in having that building language and not discounting that and feeling like, oh, I'm not actually teaching them what the reading part. I'm not teaching them reading, right? So I think that's just really helpful.
Yeah, and so while we're working on all these decoding skills and the phonemic awareness and so forth, we can also be feeding these kids really high quality language through their ears, so that we are developing those thinking skills and developing that vocabulary and all that good stuff. So I do think like a lot of times, particularly when I'm talking about reading, we all get we want to zero in on that fluency piece and the decoding piece, because it's like decoding skills and spelling skills are all very measurable. Language is a little more ethereal. It's kind of hard to get, I think, sometimes an exact read on what it is that's undermining kids' issues and listening comprehension. So, but anyway, I'm going to move us on a little bit. So we're going to kind of dig down. Oh, let me just move that over. Okay, dig down a little deeper today. And I do want to talk about different kinds of tests, just because it's been my experience that we have not done a good job of training people sort of in some of the real basics of assessment. So as I said to you just like a few minutes ago, right, sometimes our reading evaluation, our evaluation can be much bigger in scope. When we are trying to answer the question, is this a specific learning disability? Then we're going to move into that realm of intellectual assessment, kind of what falls under the domain of what we think of as like an IQ test. And I really don't think of, when I think of those tests, I don't think so much about that one score. I think about how kids demonstrate their problem solving skills in different domains. So how it is they they use language, what their vocabulary is like, their ability to perceive how perceive how facts and concepts and ideas can group together. I think about their spatial thinking, and I talked a little bit about this last time, and how it's our spatial thinking system that helps us to prioritize and organize all of those facts and concepts that we need. And if we didn't have a decent spatial system, we would appear to everyone to be really disorganized, because we wouldn't have I kind of think about, we wouldn't have a filing system in our heads that permitted us to access what we need at any given moment. And at the same time, also pull up a lot of related facts and concepts. So spatial thinking is really, you can imagine, it's like, think about what your reading comprehension would be like if your spatial thinking skills were really weak and you were trying to get through some content that was really, really dense. You would end up at the end of that text feeling kind of overwhelmed by all of these fragments, these crystallized bits of knowledge, and you would have a lot of difficulty like pulling it all together into a cohesive whole. And that's how we remember things. It's really hard to remember things that things in isolation, right? Let's go back to that chunking thing. We were always trained as educators to teach kids how to chunk information, because that's so critical to being able to step back and think in terms of a gestalt and being able to recall what it is we know when we need it. So I might also be thinking about fluid reasoning. That's the ability to do things you've never done before, to solve problems you've never encountered before. Fluid reasoning has an element of creativity, being able to handle things that are novel, being able to think out of the box. And I just want to try something with you for a second, but here's sort of my example. Everyone take your hand and make a circle, right? And I want you to put it like right up here in front of your face, right there. And now I want you to poke your head through it. Okay, Beth Ann, you got it very quickly. Have you seen that before? Oh, okay. I remember being in a lecture hall many, many years ago with like a lot of people and that being demonstrated, and none of us got it. And maybe we were sort of not a particularly high functioning group. I don't know. But the idea in that particular example, you kind of had to play with the language in it, right? You have to understand that words can have multiple meanings. And if one meaning wasn't going to work, that one, then you had to be able to try an alternative. So fluid reasoning is all about flexibility, right, in your thinking skills. And then we have like working memory. I've always think about that as a platter, where we take in new information and compare it and contrast it to what we know. I think about processing speed, the ability to do things easily and efficiently, which is key no matter what you do. So that's processing speed, that concept of doing things easily and efficiently, right? We all know that in our field with respect to reading, but it also has important implications for written expression and the idea of being able to get your ideas on paper with a flow. It's important for math, the ability to be able to execute those really basic mathematical math facts, right, as a foundation for being able to do things like long division. And both of these, when I think about them, fall in that realm of executive function. But executive function also includes things like attention and concentration and being able to gear yourself up to do something new or to bring an act to a close and move on to something else. All of those, kind of like this underlying net of skills, really teeny tiny skills that help us act with purpose and bring our products to a conclusion with some degree of quality, right? So we're going to look at vision and hearing, and I don't want to spend time on it, but we're going to look at, right, our child's background history of instruction, health issues. Health speaks to availability to learn. So when we're doing an LD evaluation, that's going to bring us into the realm of kind of different kinds of tests. And that's sort of what I want to talk about in this next little bit. And I want to see if I can't get us to test scoring systems so we can have a little fun with those. But let me just say that certain things we want to know when we test our kids, right? We want to know what skills they have. We want to know what they need to work on. And we want, in many cases, to know how our students are performing with respect to other kids of the same age or grade. And we have different ways of learning about our students. And I'm going to say that each one of these ways has a special purpose to it, right? So they're all, criterion reference tests are different from standardized norm reference tests, are different from progress monitoring probes. And I just kind of wanted to go through each one real quickly so that we can get to the exciting stuff for the day, which is that bell curve. So let's just begin. Like, as educators, we all know about criterion reference tests, right? They are typically designed by classroom teachers. The purpose of a criterion reference test is to help determine whether a student has mastered a specific body of knowledge, right? And that body of knowledge can be really, really big. Like my example here is the events that led to World War II. Or that body of knowledge can be really, really well defined, as in what we do in structured literacy when we ask children to demonstrate skills with, for example, the closed syllable pattern, to what degree they can decode CVC words. And it's criterion reference tests that let us kind of come away, right, and make certain statements about our students. So here we go. Sue earned a 93% on the unit test about volcanoes. Charlie identified 9 out of 10 CVC words correctly and with automaticity. Ming read the 4th grade passage at a rate of 70 words correct per minute with 80% accuracy. So these are tests that are specifically designed so that we can make decisions about to what degree our students have mastered certain skills. And they help us make decisions about how to pace our instruction. And whenever we do like a structured literacy lesson, we essentially we insert into it this teeny tiny criterion reference test. So like when we are teaching and we ask kids to decode a list of 10 words or spell a list of 10 words, those are all kind of mini criterion reference tests, right? So they're teacher designed. There's no research base to these tests, right? The only thing that we can't draw a conclusion based upon these tests about the internal state of someone's mind and whether they're learning disabled. All we can do is kind of say to what degree our child has mastered this body of knowledge. Sometimes we want to be able to look at issues related to progress. And I find that having done this now for like 30 years, I've sort of watched the whole progress monitoring movement unfold. And let me just say that it began as a response to frustration with the special education system. And it's like, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That's exactly where it came from, because special education system was notoriously slow in responding to students in need. Like, we all talk about how difficult it could be to identify children in 1st and 2nd grade, which meant that we couldn't identify our students until they were in 3rd or 4th grade. And at that point, they had like a really, really, really big problem. The administration of the tests that we do in special education required a specialist to come in. They could be difficult to get. There could be long time lags. And it was really frustrating to educators who could see a problem unfolding and wanted to deal with it like upfront and right away. So progress monitoring tools were developed to put control back into the teacher's hands in a low cost way that didn't require a lot of training and that would permit teachers to look at student progress over the short term. And the idea was that we would administer these really short probes to our students, sometimes a matter of like 30 seconds in length. We would get a really, really small sample of skill. But the idea is that we would do this over time and that the results would not on any given day be interpretable, but would allow us to look at trends, right, toward the end of the year benchmark. And you can see here my curriculum-based measurement graph, right, has an end of the year benchmark of 120 words correct per minute. So the hope was that given that we would be doing scientifically based instruction with trained personnel and have lots of good tools and curriculum and so forth, is that we would get a measure of our students' performance and that we could respond to it really quickly. So in this particular case, my student Matthew is earning scores below that trend line. And the hope would be that in October or November, we would look at Matthew and say, what is it that we can do to change our instruction? What can we do to enhance our instruction so that Matthew would start to learn at a faster pace, and we would increase the chance that he would end the year at benchmark level. So when progress monitoring tools came out, with all of this potential, right, to get to our students much more quickly, we did this by focusing on skills per minute, right? So here you have words correct per minute, and the overriding focus of these so the overriding focus of these tests, whether we were looking at math or whether we were looking at written expression or reading, was to look at speed, because speed, the ease with which you do something, is a more sensitive indicator of where you are in that learning cycle. We're no longer looking at, can you do it or not, right? Now we were looking at the degree to which you are proficient, because once again, there's that concept of the need to be able to do these really basic underlying skills with ease and accuracy. So progress monitoring probes don't give us like particularly helpful or useful information on any given day. They're specifically designed to help us look at movement toward a benchmark. And so they are not like a substitute for bigger criterion reference tests, which give us a much bigger sample of skill, and certainly not a substitute for standardized norm reference tests. We can't use them for diagnosis purposes. They're not going to help us identify specific learning disability. And they're not really going to give us a lot of info that's helpful instructionally, because what we're going to get are skills per minute. We're not going to get a read on specific skills that are problematic. You know, can we do CVC words with short A? Can we do CVC words with short E? They're not designed to give us that kind of information. All right, so it's a check on how we were doing. It's a check that lets us look at the risk status of our students. I'm just going to stop. Questions, thoughts?
I have a question. It seems like at least the way the conversations at our district of Winooski are going right now is that progress monitoring is beyond those little small automaticity type skills. And that we're using progress monitoring to encompass lots of very sophisticated things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about, has the way that you're talking about it there in your presentation here, has that changed so that we're I don't know, we're now talking about progress monitoring in social emotional skills, and I'm not that I want to go in that direction, but like
Yeah.
what is it like? Can we progress monitor around something like fluency, like reading fluency?
We can. So there's certain things we can do. Progress monitoring is good for skills that are really, really concrete, that are like they're good for things like we can look at the ability to decode nonsense words with fluency. We can look at the ability to recognize, you know, regular and irregular words with fluency. We can look at the ability to read passages with fluency. All those things we can do. We can use them in the same way for basic math skills, right? We can use them for, we have some tools for written expression, but they're really, the whole progress monitoring sort of thing for written expression is really limited at this point. We can look at the number of letters that someone, this letter sequences, correct letter sequences, you know, over the course of a minute. We can look at, we have some slightly more sophisticated tools that will let us look at the technical aspects of writing. Are sentences grammatical? Are they spelled correctly? Are words, is the punctuation correct? Those kinds of things. I haven't, you know, one of the areas that we don't have progress monitoring capability is listening comprehension, for example. And that's going to be, for us here in Vermont, a little problematic because we are moving away from standardized norm reference testing. We're moving more into progress monitoring as a vehicle for identifying specific learning disabilities, but we don't have the tools to measure listening comprehension and oral expression, for example, in terms of progress monitoring. So I don't know, like, I'm sort of curious, like, can we progress monitor social emotional functioning? I think we can monitor social emotional functioning. I'm not sure how we monitor in terms of progress to a final end, to a particular goal, with the same focus that we're looking at, like reading, decoding, and basic math skills. So I don't know, Michael, if I helped you with that, but anyone else comment? Things that you've seen, Haley?
Yeah, Melissa, so I always understand that the you know, anything to do with oral language or expressive language lives in the world of the SLP. And usually my SLP at school has all these different assessments that she uses to evaluate oral language.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes we give up control or whatever, we relegate that domain to our SLP. But I'm going to say, for example, we do have specific learning disabilities in both listening comprehension and oral expression, and those fall under the umbrella of specific learning disabilities. So that was, in theory, could be evaluated by a special educator who is knowledgeable about language. It's a possibility, but you're right. But I don't think too that, I think SLPs, for example, can monitor progress over the long term, you know, such as yearly with the re-administration of tests and inventories they have. I don't think they have anything that would permit them to look at progress over the short term, like over the first couple of months of the school year, like how are we doing, that check-in, how are we going to enhance our instruction? There's nothing like that at this particular point. All right, let's move into, I'm going to move us on. Standardized norm reference tests, it's the thing that makes everyone crazy. I think that the big piece here is that standardized norm reference tests, they don't speak to mastery, right? They're not going to tell us to what degree a child can decode CVC words, like whether they're at 90% or 95%, because their focus is not on mastery, but it's how our student compares to their peers by age or grade. So we get this concept of a norming sample. So the focus of these tests is where is our student going to fall along that bell curve? All right, so here's my bell curve, right? And you can see that a couple of just really important things about bell curves is that, first of all, they are symmetrical, so that they have this sort of large hump in the middle, and they kind of fade out on either side. And if we were to fold our bell curve in half, we would see that we would have the same number of high functioning students as we do low functioning students. Bell curves are distinguished by two, well, the way we score along a bell curve, the way we place our students somewhere along this bell curve. We use this language called scoring systems. And there are two really important things to understand about scoring systems. And if you understand these two really important things, then you can eyeball any scoring system that an evaluator places in front of you. It can be a wonderful thing. So we need to know the mean, which I call smack dab average, is the 50th percentile rank. And you need to know something called the standard deviation, which is like this really awful term that really what it's supposed to tell us is just how the scores spread out. It's a plus or minus value. And by definition, the range from -1 standard deviation, my first line here, to +1 standard deviation captures about the middle 2/3 of the population. All right, and you hear all my weasel words in there, right? Because there's nothing we can say as a value. We just can't state anything simply because we have to account for all different cases. So those two lines there capture the middle 2/3 of the population. I'm going to show you. So here's my chart of scoring systems. And you can see that my bell curve at the top, right, is distinguished by the mean in the center, that 50th percentile rank, which you can see all the way down at the bottom here. And then you can see that I've marked out the standard deviations. And once again, that range from -1 standard deviation to +1 captures the middle 2/3 of the population. So we have language to describe placement along the bell curve. Right? There are different kinds of scoring systems. We have standard scores, scale scores, T-scores, we have Z-scores. Neuropsychologists have a way of coming up with scoring systems that like no one's ever heard of and will never hear of again. What you need to know is that different tests will often use different scoring systems. Sometimes the same test will have multiple scoring systems. And before your head like explodes, what you really need to realize is that these different scoring systems, it's kind of like moving from yards to feet to inches. They're all in the end going to give us the same information. They're going to give us that placement along the bell curve. So if we are working with standard scores, which is one of the more commonly encountered scoring systems, we need to know that the mean is 100 and that the standard deviation is plus or minus 15. So you can see how all my lines are there. Everything is lining up here. And when you look at the range from that score of 85 to that score of 115, you should know that range captures the middle 2/3 of the population. Now that middle 2/3 of the population, we often refer to as average. The fact is that it's sort of a convention by statisticians, but the fact is that a child who comes in with an 85 has very little in common with a child who comes in at a 115, right? And this is a really big range. I mean, it's 2/3 of the population. I would get better odds if I just flipped a coin to guess a child's, intelligence, because chances are, right, with these kinds of tests, if I'm using that particular labeling system, my kid is going to be identified as having an average score. Scaled scores, another popular scoring system. That mean is 10. Standard deviation is 3. Anything between 7 and 13 captures that middle 2/3 of the population, what we sometimes call the average range, and we're going to get to that. And I'm just going to, for the sake of time, because I want to make sure we get to the sort of the good stuff today, we can also place kids. We have a different way of placing our kids along that bell curve, and they're called percentile ranks. And when I think about them, I think about kids standing in line from week is strong from that first percentile rank all the way to that 99th percentile rank, right? Smack dab in the middle. My middle score is that 50th percentile rank. But you can see they're kind of different, can't you? They're not like the other scoring system we've looked at because they don't have they're not equidistant from one another. You can see that the interval from a 5 to 10, from the 5th percentile to the 10th percentile is not the same as the interval would be from the 50th to the 55th percentile rank, right? So I think about these like the runners in a race, right? Let's go back to our line of kids. We get a few really skilled fast runners who kind of come in at the beginning. We then get like a bunch of average kind of runners. And then we get just the few of our weakest runners coming in at the end. So percentile ranks help us kind of understand, once again, that placement along the bell curve. I find parents kind of like them because it gives them sort of a visual of how it is their kids are doing in comparison to others. That's the good news. The bad news is we can't use them to measure progress because they're not equal units. It's kind of like trying to measure length with a yardstick that has inches all of different lengths. I'm going to stop. Any questions? Okay, so this is what I'm going to suggest. I want to delve into this thing with scoring systems just a little bit more. So looks like a lot of you are taking notes. Why don't you draw a bell curve for me? Make it nice and pretty. Identify the mean in the middle and draw your lines for your standard deviation, right? And remember the range that captures is like the middle 2/3 of the population. Your drawing should look something, it could look something like this. Okay, everyone have their bell curve? All right, so now let's try, whoop. I want you to think about, we're going to do something with scaled scores. And you need to know, like I said, you need to know two pieces of information. So the mean for a scaled score is a 10. So that mean line, put a 10 right there under it. And my standard deviation is plus or minus 3. So that first line should be a 7. And that last line should be a 13. Anything in that range from 7 to 13 captures the middle 2/3 of the population. So it should look something like this. So now if I was to say to you, my student earned a standard score, excuse me, a scaled score of a 12 on their reading decoding test, how would you eyeball, what would your original impression of that be? Scaled score 12.
That would be average.
Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, and it's actually kind of a healthy average, isn't it? It's kind of on that high end of average. That would be kind of a nice place. And you'd go, oh, okay, that's a nice thing to know. So what if I said to you, my kid got a scaled score of a 5?
Below average, way.
Yeah, so now you might sit up and you might kind of go, gee, I wonder what's undermining this kid's ability, right, to decode, like what is the problem here? And what if I said to you, my kid had a scaled score of 15?
Above average.
Yeah, like then you kind of know. So all I've done here is I've given you those 2 bits of information, and now you can kind of eyeball scores. You can't really look at them with any sort of a degree of exactitude, but now you can get a general sense. So let's do another bell curve or wipe out these numbers and whatever. Let's do standard scores. The mean is 100. And your standard deviation is 15. So your bell curve should look something like this. And this is all the information that you have. So if I were to say to you, you know, my kid got a standard score of 110,
That would be average.
that would be kind of, yeah, it would be kind of, it's a healthy average, isn't it? What if I said to you, my kid got a standard score of 88?
It'd still be average, but on the low side of average.
Yeah, but don't let that term average like be more meaningful than it is. It's just something the statisticians use. That average term, in our case, we could get an 86 or an 87. It might be labeled as an average score, but that's clearly a child who is in need of some support. And we're going to come back to labeling systems in just a little bit. So what if I said to you, oh, my kid had a standard score of 60. Now you're going, wow, right? We got a real problem here. And you really would want to know like what happened during the administration of that test, or how is it we have a child with such a low skill level. So let me come back kind of to my point here. I'm going to come right here. If your evaluator gives you, when they are talking about scores on tests, just these two pieces of information, right? That mean and the standard deviation, you can then start to eyeball scores. And you can get a sense of where this kind of sort of where the student falls along that bell curve. And once again, don't be like deceived by that use of the average for that middle 2/3 of the population, because kids who are coming in with scores in the 80s are often really struggling in school. They may not qualify for special education, but they're having a hard time. They're not demonstrating grade appropriate skill levels. Okay. Question? Oh, well, so let me now ask, what's absent from my picture here? What are we missing?
Stay-9.
Oh, we could have put in stay-9s. Okay, so draw your bell curve. I don't have a chart with stay-9s on it for you, but you can draw your bell curve. And what do you need to know? You need to know the mean, which is 5, and the standard deviation, which is about 2. We're going to go with 2. So that range from 3 to 7 is going to capture the middle 2/3 of the population. When I worked in New Hampshire, we used to translate everything into stay-9s in our reports. We would use the scoring system that was used by the test publisher, but then we would also have an additional column with a stay-9, and we talked stay-9s with parents because they were so easy for parents to grasp. Scale of 1 to 9, 5 is average, We don't do that. I've never seen that done here in Vermont, but okay. So what else is missing from my picture? Here we go. We're going to talk about age and grade equivalence. Wow, it took me, I don't know, it took me years to get this sorted out in my head. So the fact is, I'm going to back up just a little bit. When we do criteria and reference tests, remember the tests that are designed by educators, those are often designed to speak to mastery of a given body of knowledge, such as 4th grade skill in math computation. Okay. And we could administer those tests and we could come away and say, well, Sasha kind of earned a score, in on the 4th grade level. And we could draw that conclusion because all those items were specifically designed to help our student demonstrate what it is they could do and what it is they couldn't do on that 4th grade level. it's a whole different ballgame with norm reference tests. And when we see an age or grade equivalent on a norm reference test, we have to like disabuse ourselves of that notion that it has anything to do with age or grade level. Okay, so age or grade equivalents have nothing to do with how we conceptualize what performance should be at the second grade level or third grade level or fourth grade level. Okay, this language here is really important. Age and grade equivalents provide a level that is based on the average grade placement of all the students in the norming sample who earned the same raw score. There's just a lot of stuff packed into that sentence. I'm going to say it again. Provide a level that's based on the average grade placement of all the students in the norming sample, like from K all the way up through grade 12, who got the same raw score. I'm going to take you through this in a little bit more detail because it's kind of hard to visualize. Okay, so we administered the ABC test. And we were testing kids in my norming sample from first grade all the way through ninth grade. The age grade equivalent is based on the average grade placement of all the kids in the norming sample who earned the same raw score. So the kids who earned a raw score of 1 happen to be in first grade, and second grade. If I take the average, I get a grade equivalent of 1.3. The kids who earned a raw score of 2 happen to be in first grade, second grade, and second grade. When I take the average, I get a grade equivalent of 1.8. I'm going to jump ahead. All the kids who got a raw score of 5 were in second grade. We had a 4th grader and an 8th grader. When I take the average, I get a grade equivalent of 4.0. And when I look at the kids who got a raw score of 6, the actual grade placement of those kids was 3rd grade, 5th grade, and 9th grade. And when I take the average, I get a grade equivalent of 5.0. Can you like ponder this for a second or process this for a second? Sandy, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, wow. This is such a good way to explain this because it makes so much more sense, I think, to people than sometimes it's too much verbiage when you say it's not really
It's not.
accurate, but
Yeah.
this really illustrates it.
You know, so now let me give you some more language for this. And we can come back to this table if you want to look at it again. Okay. So what it is that we're getting with that grade equivalent is just the average grade placement of kids who performed in the same way, who came out with, okay. So they don't specify a particular expectation for what kids would be doing in any grade. They have nothing to do with that. They're not linked to how instruction unfolds over the course of a school year. Coming in at a 4.3 grade equivalent doesn't compare in any way to getting like a 4.8 grade equivalent. Because of the way in which they're calculated, you can't compare grade equivalents from one test to another test because they have to do with that norming sample and that norming sample alone. And I'll tell you, years ago, I used to go to team meetings and people would report grade equivalents And one person would say that Charlie earned a grade equivalent of 3.0 on the math test on the KTA. And then someone else would give a Wyatt and would come out with a grade equivalent of 2.5. And we'd have huge arguments, right? Over, oh my gosh, it's upsetting to parents. Like, well, how come he only got a 2.5 here? Age and grade equivalents are not meaningful in any way, and you can't use them to look at progress. So if we have a kid who moves from a 3.2 grade equivalent to a 4.2 grade equivalent, it doesn't mean he's made a year's progress. There's nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with curriculum, nothing to do with expectations. And then the last bit is that kids with the same grade equivalent can have very different profiles. And it's a little bit unfair of me to put this in here because that's true of any score. We could have two kids with the same IQ scores and they would have very different profiles. But let me kind of show you what that looks like. We have Sasha and Pasha. They each earned a raw score of 4. You can see that, and you're all educators, you know this. Sasha did addition, subtraction with regrouping, and a little bit of multiplication. Pasha did addition, no subtraction, some multiplication, and short division. They both earned this, came away with the same raw score, but they have very different instructional needs. Let's see, I don't know if, yeah. So let me come back to here. So it's not like anyone sat down and looked at the scope and sequence from grade 1 to grade 12. Oh, Gwen, question?
I'm hoping that you're gonna come here, but could you talk about then why they're even a part of the information that we get sometimes on kids? How are they helpful or useful?
Okay, good question. And I'm smiling because when you look at any test manual and they have, like, there's always that section on our test scoring systems and how we're reporting things. The section on the verbiage on age and grade equivalence will tell you it's the least reliable way of discussing a child's performance. And some will kind of even go so far as to tell you you just shouldn't use them because they don't mean what people think they're meaning. And I'm going to tell you, I think the reason that they continue, the test publishers continue to produce them is because there's a huge section of the population out there that thinks they're helpful and useful and likes to share them with parents. So I think it's more of a marketing thing and trying to be all things to all people when we really should just do the right thing. Sometimes every once in a while you get researchers too, who will report grade equivalence in addition to their other statistics. And they can look really awful. And one other thing, let me just say to you that within any particular actual classroom placement, you're going to have several years of variation in the grade equivalence. You're going to have a wide range. So sometimes you might have a kid in 4th grade. He might earn sort of one of those kind of low averagey scores, but the grade equivalent is going to come in as 3rd grade. And it's all kind of still in the average range, but it's really upsetting to parents. Every once in a while, I have parents who insist they want them in a report. And I might put them in, but then I have this huge footnote that I've written that talk about people are not getting what they think. These don't mean, they don't refer to actual grade level performance. And then I go back to my language here, provide a level that's based on the average grade placement of all the students in the norming sample who earn the same raw score. And the norming sample can be from pre-K all the way up into college. And we all know that averages are a really tricky thing, don't we? So how are we doing with this? So the big thing is like, you can't use them to say that it's a measure of progress.
So would it be correct to assume that each time they do a new they renorm a test, that those grade equivalents could change because they're
Oh,
going to,
yeah,
so-
it could change based upon the norming, so sure.
so it's really a measure of your norming sample average, which may be irrelevant. I know. All right. So that's interesting. So not the same. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's, let me just say, there's no good that comes from reporting age and grade equivalence, because you're going to upset somebody over what they think it means and not what it actually means. And it doesn't actually mean, I mean, once again, they're not equal units, so we can't even talk about what it means to go from a 4.2 to a 4.5. I will say, I just feel the need to say, and I don't think I have it for you today. No, but if you look at the protocols for the Woodcock-Johnson, like tests of achievement for each subtest, they will give you the grade equivalents, right? And I've never understood why they do that. But the interesting thing is, particularly in the higher grade levels, you can read like just one or two more words correctly, and you can advance several grade equivalent levels. And I've just like, wow, we read 5 more words and we advanced 5 years. Like, you know, and I don't know why they do that, why they feel the need to do that. I've never understood that, but they've done it forever. So how are we doing with grade equivalent? Are we good? You can always, like, if you have questions later, you know, you can always email me or whatever. So the last thing I want to, I wanted to talk about are those, you know how I've been throwing around that average range, and I've said to you, we're capturing the middle 2/3 of the population, but don't be fooled. Average doesn't mean okay. All right, so different tests use different labeling systems for the scores along the bell curve. And I've been in meetings where I've seen 2 evaluators argue over whose labeling system was the correct one. And the fact is that here's from David Wexler himself, although this I think was published after he died. Yes, pretty much so. Qualitative descriptors are only suggestions and they're not evidence-based, and you can use alternate terms as appropriate. And this comes from a chart my mentor, John Willis, loved to append charts to reports and things, and he had charts for everything. And so he had charts with the labeling systems for the different tests that he used in the evaluation. So that if you really wanted to know what the labeling system was for the Biri Buktenica, then you could look up their labeling system and you could compare and contrast that to the labeling systems by the people, you know, who did the KTA and the Wyatt and so forth. And what I kind of want you to really to see is that the labeling systems are totally arbitrary, that you can have a student with the same raw score, and that same raw score can have a different label depending on the test that you're using. So here we have a raw score of 110, and if we're using a WISC, it would be called high average. If we were using the FAR, the RIAS, it could be above average. If we were using the Woodcock-Johnson, it becomes average. You kind of see what starts to happen. So what some evaluators do is they'll put a footnote in their report and they'll use one labeling system. So at the Stern Center, we have adopted one labeling system so that we're not getting ourselves all out of joint by using different labeling systems by different publishers in the same report. But we tell people that we're doing that. And you can see in some cases, like that average range. So the Wyatt, the average range goes from 85 to 150. That's kind of what we've been talking about. But that, you know, that goes from a 60th percentile. I got you. Oh, just reminded myself. It goes from like a 60th percentile to 85th percentile rank. Did I do that right? Sorry, 84th percentile rank. I gave you all a chart of scores, and I just wanted to make just sort of a comment about it. This is often just kind of handy to take to team meetings, and if you couple this with a picture of bell curve, you can help like parents to understand like where their kid is falling. I just wanted to change some of the labels at the top to make it clearer, because they have a the nice people at Pearson had this funny way of labeling, but that first column, those are your scaled scores. You can see the range from 1 to 19. Those are scaled scores. And then you have your standard scores, percentile ranks. See the stay nines over on the end? And then something called a normal curve equivalent. They're kind of like percentile ranks, only they're equal units. They use them a lot in the field of education. So anyway, helpful things that evaluators do. Experienced evaluators have memorized, right, a lot of the scoring systems and can transpose easily in their heads. It takes time to learn that, but it's rather a good skill to have. And why would you want to be able to do that? Why would you want to be able to know that a 10 is equal, a scaled score of 10 is equal to a standard score of 100 is equal to a stay 9 of 5. It makes proofing reports much more easily. You can catch like errors and things that other people do. It's kind of like a parlor trick at team meetings. So questions on labeling systems. How are we doing on time? Oh, heck no. Okay, we're good. We're good. All right. I'm not sure how far. Let's just see how far we. So a couple of things about tests. Test publishers are sort of duty bound in the realm of standardized norm reference testing for giving us a lot of research that speaks to the quality of the test and the fact that the test can make the claims that it makes, the fact that we can draw certain conclusions from this. So for example, we call this validity. We really want to be sure that what we're measuring allows us to say certain things. If I'm administering the Wechsler intelligence scales, there is research that allows me to draw certain conclusions and say certain things about the nature of intelligence in the particular student that we're working with. I can't, for example, right, measure the circumference of my head and say that it's a valid measure of intelligence, right? So test publishers are sort of duty bound to make sure that to provide us with the research that says that this test actually does what we say it does. They're also duty bound to provide us with research about the consistency of the test, what they call the reliability, and that will we get the same scores if the test is administered by different evaluators? Will we get the same scores if we administer Form A and Form B? Anyway, we get a whole chapter full of tables and things related to the consistency of a given test. As an evaluator, I want to say that things that we look at when we get a new test, one of the things we look at is kind of test length. And I don't mean to sound like that I have the sort of the wrong intent or wrong focus here, but we really want tests that are going to be long enough to allow us to get a good sample of this child's skill set. Because if this sample is too small, if it's too short, we're going to have difficulty. The scores we get may well be elevated. And if the sample that we're getting from our student is too long, our students start to get tired, our students start to get annoyed, and evaluators have difficulty paying attention and hanging in there themselves. So we kind of, I call it the Goldilocks principle. We want our standardized norm reference test to be detailed enough to allow us to get a good read of where our student falls on that bell curve. I kind of like to have a decent sample of the skills that we're looking at. Like, it would be nice, for example, to have, it's nice to have a certain sample of decoding skills. Let me just tell you that, I said that these tests, standardized norm reference tests, don't let us speak to mastery. They only sample skills so that we can place kids on that bell curve. The Woodcock-Johnson word ID subtest, I think, has 5 CVC words. The KTA has, I believe, 4 CVC words, and the Wyatt has like 5 or 6 CVC words. All right, that's part of the whole sample of skills. It's a sample. It's not enough to make a statement regarding mastery. So if I'm only asking my kid to read 6 CVC words, I can't make that statement regarding identified CVC words with like 95% accuracy, which is kind of what we're looking for. So the short sample, is what often happens when we test really young kids, right? So when we're testing young kids is kind of a, it's like a specialty of assessment, because there are 2 things that we have to know a lot about. We have to know a lot about child performance at that particular age, what it is, what's a reasonable expectation for 5 and 6-year-olds. We also have to know a lot about the test we're using, because we're only going to get a really small sample of the skills that we want to know about for 5 and 6-year-olds, right? Because remember that these tests are designed, right, to measure skills in kids from preschool all the way through to college. So the number of items that actually apply to really young kids is going to be really, really small. And when we get a really, really small sample, the scores it's going to give us are often going to be elevated. So I wanted to show you this. I'm going to jump out of my slides for a second here and see if I can see if I haven't zapped it. Oh, did I lose it? Hang on. Okay. Let me pull it up for you. Okay, so here we go. So this is a website that my advisor did many, many years ago, and it's not clear to me to what degree it is still maintained. Whoops. Hang on just a second. Okay, so here we are. So this is what happens when we test really young kids. Can you all see this? Is this big enough? I'm going to try to make it bigger. There we go. All right, so this is an evaluation of a child who is named Sam McGee. And the background history is going to be really important here, and so is the information up front. So this is Sam McGee, test date February 1999. We have his birthday, and we also have a death date. Whoops, hang on, I just lost it here. Let me above link. Where'd it go? My apologies. I had this. Oh, dear, 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 dear. Well, I may have to show it to you next time. Get you all excited, and then here, hang on. Let me see. Let's try this again. Oh, isn't that funny? I can't, well, it's not so funny, but embarrassing moments of I'm going to give this one more try. If I can't get it, then okay. I think we've. All right, so here we are. Okay, this is what happens when kids get raw scores of 0. And I was talking about the problem we have with the design of our tools that we use with really young kids. So the referral question, tragically, Sam died in a dog sledding misadventure just after being referred and was cremated on the lake of the margin of Lake Labarge. However, pursuant to our best guess regarding the long promised regulations for IDA 97, you can see this is old, we completed the evaluation posthumously just to be on the safe side. We have a bunch of behavioral information. He was very quiet during the evaluation, not at all restless, showed no signs of distractibility. I will let you go back to this on your own, but let's look at our test scores. Okay. His scores are shown below. He achieved raw scores of 0 on all subtests. His oral reading scores were markedly uneven, but his reading comprehension was fairly strong, below average to low average for his age. His spelling scores varied from low to below average for his age. Standard scores were consistently in a range of 68 to 85. Listening, speaking, and math skills were all weak. So I just want you to take a look, for example, for a second. So here our student is. He 6 years old. Didn't answer any questions correctly on our evaluation. And yet somehow we get accuracy in reading words aloud from a list in the 23rd percentile rank. He did really well answering oral questions about reading passages. He earned a percentile rank of 30. And you can kind of scan that list and you can see that in some cases, a 0 raw score gets us about what we would think. Now, this was done several years ago, but I want you to know that if you were to take a look at the WIAT, the KTA, the phonological awareness test, that second edition, you would see a very similar problem. And the problem is that these scores often end up in reports, and we are really persuaded by numbers and by labels. And we might lose out on the fact that our student didn't demonstrate any skill at all. So this is what happens when you try to administer a standardized norm reference test to really young kids, like in kindergarten and in first grade, and they aren't able to answer any questions at all. And we put it into those norming tables, and we look up those scores, we actually get scores.
Melissa, can I ask you a question? When is
Yes.
the ideal time to test? I teach in a private school, and we start looking at skills very, very young. And
Yep.
I often have second grade parents feeling like we have done their child a disservice by not getting them tested sooner. And my feeling is we've barely had the opportunity to offer good instruction for a period of time. And there's such a push to get identified early and tested early. So I'm wondering how to respond to that.
I think and I want to say there's a really simple answer to that, but there really isn't, because we all know how important it is to identify children sooner rather than later, right? And that really, with respect to reading in particular, it's really important to make sure that we are addressing their needs in kindergarten and first grade, because if they don't finish first grade on grade level, the prognosis for them is just really pretty awful. I think that there's a lot in my head, and I'm trying to figure out how to get it all out in a semi-organized fashion. For the purpose of identifying a specific learning disability, that can be really tricky because that presumes instruction. And you're absolutely right. When we're working with children who are like in kindergarten and so forth, they haven't had a lot of instruction. And so that particular aspect of identifying a child becomes really, really iffy. Like, how can you, a specific learning disability presumes that kids have been taught, you know. The tools that we use, let me just say, you really have to look at the norming tables for the tools that we use for young children to ensure that there's a reasonable sample of items at the kindergarten level and at the first grade level. That becomes really, really important. I think at the kindergarten level, we are kind of better off in some ways with the criterion reference tests, which allow us to get a larger sample of very, very specific skills, because on a lot of the norm reference tests, the skills that are sampled can be really kind of hit or miss, right? It's a small sample. It's just to place kids on the bell curve. It's not to help us understand exactly what it is, the skill set that children have. It can give us indications, but it can't really answer those questions with any specificity. So I'm a real big fan of criterion reference tests, progress monitoring tools that we have for really, young kids. I am comfortable testing kids for learning disabilities mid first grade, like in January or so. And I say that because by that point, we can have an expectation that kids would have mastered their CVC words. They would know those short vowels, and that can be really, really telling. Beth Ann?
Yeah, I have 2 questions about that, and if it takes us down the wrong path, you can just tell me to wait. One is just your thoughts on the different dyslexia screeners that are out there right now that are being administered in like K1 through things like the MAPS Fluency, and there's some other ones out there. I'm kind of curious about that. And the second piece, sort of on behalf of our kindergarten teachers, is that, you know, we often have waited to let kids get acclimated to school.
Yeah.
And yet they will tell you, and they are often right, I knew, you know, and that on certain kids that where we would be with what the conversation was going to be in April. And oftentimes those students are coming in with IEPs from their early childhood program that are that global developmental delay. So we're really trying to figure out where to put our resources in our school, get kids early enough, but not, we know how unreliable some of those screeners are at the beginning of kindergarten. So I know it's a can of worms, but anything you have to say would be really helpful.
Yeah, you know, screeners by their nature are designed to pick up those kids that are high risk. You know, it's kind of all about the odds. I'm sort of hesitating because like the question is sort of really, the question is really quite huge. Screeners are really designed so that we get a really small sample of skills that they have validated with their research, so that we know that I'm not saying this very well. The skills are selected on screeners that are going to be highly predictive of a child's performance in the future. I'm not sure the screeners tell us anything more than risk status. And it seems to me that we can get risk status in a lot of different ways that are really quite easy. I'm a real big fan of looking at alphabet knowledge. You know, the ability to learn the alphabet, it's like this microcosm of a reading task. It's highly predictive of future reading skill. The ability to write the alphabet in first grade is hugely predictive of who's going to learn how to write and who's not. You know, like really basic things. And I may be going off track here, forgive me, but when I test kids, I think I talked about this last time, I often look at alphabet knowledge and as sort of a marker, not just in really, really young kids, but as an indicator of the struggle that our older students have faced over the years with skills that they never got to master in all the way back in kindergarten. You know, I agree with this thing that like most of our teachers know, that our teachers know, like kindergarten teachers know pretty quickly, you know, who's going to get it, who's not going to get it, because they have a much larger sample of overall performance than we can possibly get from any of the screening tools. You know, it seems to me that if we have a curriculum that is scientifically based and we teach that curriculum and we progress monitor as part of that instruction, that in some ways that gives us everything that we need to know without doing an additional measure of some kind of screener. Now that I've said that, probably part of me wants to go, no, but I think that's pretty true, that I'm not sure that we need additional screening methods if we have a good curriculum in place and we're doing our mini criteria reference tests as part of our instruction and that sort of thing. If we have our data from our instruction, let me say it that way. Did I even come close to answering what you asked?
It's a huge question. And I just read something about how they talked about it's not just how many letters you know, but how quickly you're acquiring them when you get into kindergarten. So you can have a student come in who had no preschool experience and 0 letters, but if they start to learn them quickly, it's like, okay, you're probably going to be okay.
Probably going to be, yeah.
That seems to match with what you're saying. It's a little bit of like RTI in kindergarten. Once you get there, we're starting to see you grow pretty quickly. Maybe we don't worry so much about that September benchmark score. That sound about?
Well, yeah, I think we know that score, right? It's there, but I would agree with you. It's the rate at which you acquire. And if you're acquiring those skills with ease, then the prognosis is probably pretty good, isn't it?
And it's back to being confident that there's good classroom instruction happening.
Yeah.
Critical.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? It's 5:30 now. I can talk a little bit about report writing maybe next time. We've actually gone through kind of most of what I wanted to get through with you today. But, you know, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you have questions, send me an email tomorrow. I'm happy to answer your questions. Let me just take us all the way here. You can see all my stuff here on. Whoops. We are meeting next on March 5th. And if you can't make it, don't worry. I will be recording and the recordings will be sent to you all as a just in case. And I will thank the Vermont chapter of the Reading League for having me. So on that note, thank you guys. I will hang out for a bit if you have anything you want to ask me. I'm going to stop the recording now. Figure out how to do that.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Melissa.